let's jump into episode 3, paternal side of my family. So, my paternal side of the family, I don't have as much in-depth information on just because there was a little bit more of a relationship with my maternal side than there was my paternal side of the family, but I'm going to do my best to describe them. So I'm going to start with my great-grandmother. When I was younger, we would go over to my great-grandmother's house quite often and visit her. So I will start by talking about her. She had 13 biological children, and she decided, you know what? There's this child that is in need, and she adopted a 14th child. And she raised these children originally in a 2-bedroom house, and then they moved to a little bit of a larger house right behind that house. My dad, which is her grandchild, actually has aunts that were younger than him. So my great grandma was still having children after my dad was born, which is just mind blowing to me. Like, it's wow. But yeah, so my great grandmother, if you can imagine this is what I would see when I would go visit her. She had the whitest curls, and she had these little curls and white hair, and she would be sitting in her rocking chair with her sweater or an afghan wrapped around her, and she'd be rocking in her chair, and she'd have her Bible next to her. But here's the thing with her. She knew everyone's names. She could place the kids with the parents. So she knew her kids, she knew her grandkids, and she knew the great-grandkids, and she knew who you belonged to. You could walk in her door without your parent with you, and she would know whose kid you were. That's a lot of kids to remember. So let me try to explain this a little bit better. Towards the end, she had Alzheimer's. And so I had gone to visit her with a friend of mine. Instead of it being me and my sister, it was me and my friend. When we walked in the door, she thought I was my sister, and she thought my friend was me. And she knew that we were my dad's kids. So although she didn't quite get it right, she thought that my friend was me, she was still able to place the fact that we were my father's kids. That, you know what I mean, if that makes sense. So she was still so bright even towards the end. She was still so good at placing which kids with which family member. But to explain how big the family was, she, like I said, had 13 kids and adopted a 14th. My grandpa and grandma, my dad's parents, they had 6 kids, and those 6 kids had 15 kids altogether between them as far as grandkids went. So that's just one set of her grandkids. The rest of them had even more. So my family on that side is huge. So that's my great grandma. She had a huge heart. She loved fully. She was very religious, very sweet, very kind. As far as any mental health issues, I don't think there was ever any talked about or anything negative ever said. As far as she went, she just had a very large giving heart. She was married to my great grandpa, and the only stories that I've ever heard of my great grandpa there's one story that I did hear about him, and that was that he was a drinker, and that he was drinking one night and he put so much coal into the fire that they had to open all the windows in the middle of winter because the house had gotten so unbelievably hot that they couldn't stand how hot it was, and he didn't even realize he had done it because he had been drinking so much. So I believe that he was a drinker from what I understand, but as far as any mental health issues, I don't know as far as my great grandpa goes on that side. My great grandmother, I don't believe there was any. I just know that she suffered from Alzheimer's or dementia towards the end. but she was still very, very bright towards the end. So let's go ahead and jump into my grandma on the paternal side. My grandma was very tiny and very feisty, but she had to be. She had 6 children. She had 2 girls and the rest were boys. And when I say boys, I mean these were the boys that were out there getting themselves in trouble. One of those was my dad, and these were the boys back in the day that were out there racing the cars and doing the things that you can imagine back in the 70s and the 60s. So she was trying to keep her boys in line. And then she had the 2 girls that were growing up with these boys. So you can only imagine what she was dealing with these 6 kids. And then on top of that, she had my grandpa. And my grandpa was an alcoholic. And from what I have heard from different people throughout my whole family, my grandpa was very hard. He was very hard on the kids. He was very hard on her. He was very hard to deal with when he was drinking. And so life sometimes in that household was very difficult. And with that being said, my grandma had to be tough. But she loved so fully. Like, that is the one thing I have heard every single one of my aunts and uncles say about their mom, is that she loved so unconditionally and so fully, but she also had such a strength to her that they knew not to mess around, but they knew that she would catch them if they fell, if that makes sense. That's just the type of person that they've always been able to describe her as. Now, here's one story that I was told about her, is that my dad and no, it wasn't my dad, it was his 2 brothers were in the yard fighting, physically fighting. And she yelled at them to stop and they wouldn't stop. So she picked up a 2x4 and started swinging it at them to get them to stop. Now remember, she's a little tiny, tiny woman and she's dealing with these big boys trying to get them to stop. So she picked up a 2x4 and started swinging it at them and trying to get them to stop. And they thought when the 2x4 would hit them that it was one of them hitting the other, so they started fighting worse. So she started swinging the 2x4 even harder. And eventually they realized it was her with the 2x4 and they knocked it off and they stopped. But I thought that was kind of a funny story. But also, this goes again to show you, a 2x4, really? We're hitting with a 2x4? But that's, the way she handled them. But the memories I have of her is she threw Christmas at her house, Christmas Eve. And we would show up and the whole living room was full of Christmas presents. Like the entire living room. She had to have spent the whole year Christmas shopping. Like, she had to have. It wasn't my grandpa. He didn't do any of that stuff, and he openly admitted that he had nothing to do with Christmas. He said, I give her the money and she does it. But the entire living room would be full of Christmas presents. Now remember, they had 6 kids, and out of those 6 kids came 15 grandkids. So she would go and she would shop for all 15 of us grandkids, and there would be presents covering the entire living room for 15 grandkids and multiple presents for each grandkid. And we would all show up on Christmas Eve and spend Christmas Eve at Grandma and Grandpa's opening, all these Christmas presents. And it was a magical time. Unfortunately, she passed away when I was pretty young, and that Christmas tradition didn't continue on after she passed. But it was really beautiful memories. And as far as mental health issues go, again, with her or my grandpa, I really don't know about that. I would guesstimate that there was something there, but I don't 100% know. I do know a lot more about my aunts and my uncles because growing up, my aunts and my uncles were a huge part of my life. I feel conflicted on whether or not I should talk about my aunts and uncles because they are still here with us and it is their private business, and some of what has happened in my life is directly related to them. I will say that I had 3 of my cousins come live with us because of a situation that arose within one of my aunt's lives. I may talk about that further, but I know there was mental health issues there. I know that one of my uncles, I will talk about him right now and say that he has some severe mental health issues on my paternal side of the family. That uncle, I will tell a story about him right now. I remember at Christmas time, one of my cousins really liked a hat that he had saw on a man that was walking by. And my nephew, or my cousin said, I really like that hat. I really want Santa to bring me one of those for Christmas. And my uncle told us to go in the house. And so we went in the house. And a little while later, that hat showed up in the house for my cousin. Well, it was a little while later, a couple years or so later, we ended up finding out that my uncle really wanted to give that hat to my cousin. And so he beat the guy up and took the hat so that he could make my cousin's Christmas dream come true. So I laugh about this because that's the only thing I can do. My uncle has a heart of gold. He would give the last dollar in his pocket to make someone that he loves happy. But he doesn't always go about it the right way. But he's very kind to those he loves. But he definitely does struggle with mental health issues. And I believe that many of my aunts and uncles do on my paternal side. But I don't think that it would be fair for me to sit here and try to break down what they have or which one in particular and so on and so forth. I just think that a lot of them struggle, and a lot of them struggle from their childhood, and a lot of them just had life kind of stomp on them a little bit and maybe never dealt with that, or maybe they have now that they're older. But I really don't think it would be fair for me to go into that. So the next person I'd like to talk a little bit about, because he definitely plays a big part in my life, is my dad. So my dad has definitely struggled with mental health. I don't think he knew that he was struggling with mental health when he was younger. He grew up in the 60s and 70s, of course, so he dabbled in all of the wild things, and he has been very open, and I'm thankful that he's been very open with me and talked to me about a lot of the things that he did, and he was never shy with me about the mistakes that he made. And I'm thankful for that, because that kept me from making some of those same mistakes. However, he lived a very wild life, and I think when my sister and I were born, he tried to rein that in. I don't think he fully reined it in, though, and I think that the problems between my mom and him very much still affected my sister and I as children. I think that he wanted to make it better and didn't know how. I think, in fact, we've had conversations where he said, if I would have done this different, or if I would have done that different, or maybe I should have done this, but I just didn't know. He now sees different things he could have done, but at the time going through life the way that we did, he didn't know how to change it, which I completely understand. So my dad definitely has mental health struggles, and a lot of that I didn't know. I thought my dad had this like all-encompassing confidence, and just he was a hero to me. I think every little girl, they look at their dad and they're a hero, and there's nothing their dad can't handle. And that's what I thought with my dad. And to this day, he still is my hero, and he will always be my hero. So, and I think he's even more my hero now that I know that he too can admit that there is some things that he needs to work on, or needed to work on, and he sees that now. And I think that makes him more of a hero to me today, that he can admit those things versus just pretending that everything was fine. So that is the paternal side of my family's breakdown. And we will start to get into more of the everyday life moving forward in episode 4. So wishing you all much kindness and much love. Bye for now.